Hello, everybody. Not a lot of sleep last night, thanks to our 2.5-year-old who's still not sleeping through the night, and still not even sleeping for more than like a couple of hours at a time. She is exhausting, but yeah. So not a lot of sleep, but yeah, I'm here. We're cracking on with Escape from Furnace Execution. We have. So yeah, Alex, who is pretty much a berserker now. He's kind of retained some of his personality, quite a lot of it really, actually. But he is physically a berserker, with 2 blades for arms and a kind of broken body. He is now in the hands of the army, including a Colonel Alice Panettiere. And at first he thinks, oh, this is cool. But he's started to realise that actually Panettiere is experimenting quite ruthlessly on him and the other escaped inmates from Furnace. And he's kind of wondering, hang on a minute, has she really got my best interest at heart? And of course, maybe she doesn't, because she's trying to stop. Sorry, I was just making sure I had room on my computer for this file. Yeah, so she's trying to stop what she sees as kind of an invasion of the country by Alfred Furnace's soldiers. Alex is having visions of a boy in an orchard who's a young Alfred Furnace, and has just been kind of stabbed and left to death by his left for dead by his mum and by everyone else in his village, because he was accused of murdering his little brother. He's also not alone in the orchard, Alfred Furnace, because he is there with something he calls the Stranger. We don't really know what that is, except that Alex is very afraid of it, and so is Alfred. And yeah, so Alex has just been carved up a little bit inside one of the laboratories, and he's feeling a strange kind of brotherhood with the other creatures inside Furnace. Who escaped from Furnace inside this laboratory. Sorry, I told you I didn't have much sleep. And yeah, so his last line was, "We have to get out of here." Okay, into the pit. This can't be good. Nothing good ever happens in a pit. It was night by the time they finished with me. The skylights had darkened into eyes that peered inside like observers at an autopsy. I'd been drifting in and out of consciousness for hours now, each tiny dose of nectar rebooting my system for just a few seconds. Every time I fell into sleep, the orchard rose up around me, trees sprouting from the ground, branches coiling up over my bed like the tentacles of some sea monster. Then I'd blink and be back in the hospital, Panettiere slicing away while her doctors stared goggle-eyed. But I knew the dream was still there, awaiting my return. I couldn't hide from it forever. At some point, the black suit next to me died. I watched it happen, saw the spark in his eyes sputter, flare brightly for a fraction of a second, then fade. A while later, some soldiers cut his body loose from the table and dragged it away, I guess to an incinerator somewhere. It was shortly afterwards that Panettiere threw her scalpel into a dish and wiped her nectar-encrusted hands on her white overalls. "I think we're done here," she wheezed through her gas mask. "Send the results to my quarters. I need to double-check them." The scientists began to drift away until only the colonel remained. She rested a hand on the table and wiped her other arm over her mask, feigning mopping the sweat from her brow. "Whew," she said to me. "That was tough, but you've done well, Alex. We've learned a great deal today about you and the disease inside you. Are you feeling okay?" I didn't need to see my body to know what it looked like. Pockmarked with fresh wounds, craters in my skin like the surface of the moon. When she saw I wasn't going to answer, she carried on. "The nectar. It's astonishing," she said. "It's unlike anything we've ever seen before. It's almost, I don't know, intelligent. The way it targets wounds, like a supercharged clotting agent. Only more than that, too. It functions so much more efficiently than blood, carrying 20, maybe 30 times as much oxygen. And it makes your physiology go haywire. Seems to act like a neurological drug, numbing emotional transmissions, fear, any kind of reason." She shook her head, as if she couldn't believe the words coming out of her own mouth. "It's no wonder we're getting hammered out there. An army filled with this stuff could win any war full stop. She paused, lost somewhere in her own imagination, and the way her eyes lit up made my skin crawl. It was a while before she remembered that I was there. But there's so much left to do before we truly understand what this liquid is. It's quite unpredictable. For instance, why does it affect different people differently, turning some into psychotic, mindless killers, the ones you call rats, and others into monsters? I mean, those berserkers have completely changed. There's nothing human in them anymore. And how come some of you can talk, the ones in suits? She looked at me as if expecting to be enlightened, only waiting for a second or two before continuing her barrage of questions. And what about you? You seem to be somewhere in between. You have the body of a monster, a berserker, and yet you seem to have the mind of a normal teenager. It really doesn't make much sense. Do you remember anything about this? Did the warden explain it? My life in the prison seemed so long ago now that even if the warden had told me the full truth about the nectar, I doubt I could have remembered it. Well, no matter, she said. I can understand why you're too tired to speak. It's been a long day, but it's not quite over yet, I'm afraid. There's a little something we need you to do for us. It won't take long and then you can sleep, I promise. She nodded to somebody behind me, and I heard an engine start up, the sound of gears crunching, the whine of an approaching vehicle. Panettiere stood to one side as a small forklift truck wheeled into view, its prongs sliding under my table. There was a jolt as the table was lifted off the floor, the room spinning like a fairground ride. "Don't worry, Alex," came Panettiere's voice. She walked along beside me as the truck carted me across the room, heading for a large loading door. Dozens of creatures watched us pass from the operating tables, their constant motion as they thrashed and bucked, making me feel like I was on a boat sailing across an ocean of wounded flesh. It shouldn't be dangerous. Not for you. We just need to see how the nectar works in I guess you'd call it a combat situation. I didn't have time to ask her what she meant. A couple of soldiers pulled open the loading door and the truck passed through it into a canvas tunnel that concealed the night sky for the 50-metre journey across a concrete yard to a second brick building. We crawled through it, entering through a wide door. At first I thought it was another white-tiled operating theatre, like the one I'd been in moments ago. Then I noticed the massive pit in the floor. Wait. No, not a pit. A pool. It was a swimming pool, only all the water had been drained away. It was surrounded by a metal cage, or its sides parallel with the edges of the pool. I peered through those shining bars as the forklift carried me closer, almost expecting to see a pair of cage fighters, as if this was some bizarre TV game show. But all I saw was a sloped floor rising out of a crimson swamp, as if somebody had been trying to fill the pool with blood. There were soldiers and scientists surrounding the cage, all in gas masks, too many of them to count. My guts began to twist, and I wondered if I should be trying to get loose, trying to escape. But I stayed quiet, and I stayed still. Instinct told me that I'd need to save what little strength I had for whatever was about to happen. "Put him straight in," Panettiere shouted. "Prep the others." A door in the side of the cage slid open, and the forklift eased me forwards until I was dangling over the deep end. To either side of me there was a roar as two chainsaws started up in stereo. I heard somebody barking out a countdown, and then I was bathed in sparks, the whole room lighting up. Before I could make sense of what was going on, the coils of shipping wire around me loosened, the forklift lurched, and I found myself falling. I landed in a pile of something soft and wet, my operating table striking the floor next to me, splintering the tiles. There was a crunch overhead as the cage door grated shut, and I looked up in time to see the doctors crowd around it, Panettiere pushing to the front. I managed to lift myself onto my haunches, but that was as far as I could go. When I attempted to stand up, the whole room cartwheeled, my legs too weak to hold me. I crouched, trying to haul in a breath, my whole body trembling with the effort. I realised that I was dressed in a flimsy hospital gown, needles and sensor pads still plastered all over my skin. "Can you hear me down there, Alex?" said Panettiere. "Those pads on you there, they'll tell us what we need to know. You don't have to worry about any of that. All we're asking you to do is help us out a little. Will you do that?" Something howled, a banshee's cry that echoed off the tiled walls, scraping down my spine. "Stand well away," I heard somebody say. "Dump it straight in." Another forklift truck rolled into view on the lip of the pool. This one held a cage, and cramped inside it was a berserker. It wasn't like any I had seen to date, its body made up of yellow-white skin that was knotted and warped as though carved from solid bone. Its skull was huge and cone-shaped, arching back like a cycling helmet. I'd seen pictures of African tribes who'd bound their skulls to make them long and pointy, and this reminded me of them. The creature's forehead jutted so far forward that its face was cast into shadow, and only when it arched its back did I get a good look at it. Its eyes, nose, and mouth were clustered right in the middle of its head, squished together like the punched-in features of a cartoon figure hit with a frying pan. I didn't see how a face like that could still function, but it must have, because the berserker turned its eyes in my direction, sniffing the air. A tiny tongue poking from the pencil sharpener hole of its mouth, licking at non-existent lips. The berserker's cage was pushed right up against the door above me, and in a single motion both hatches were slid open. So I've got a bit of lunch in my teeth. The creature leapt down into the pool, causing a crimson tsunami. I scrabbled back, adrenaline making the most of what little nectar was left in my system. The berserker didn't attack, just cocked its head as if trying to get a good look at me with its underdeveloped eyes. This close, I could see that they were lumpy and off-white, like fried eggs with their yolks broken. The forklift truck wheeled back, beeping, but as soon as it had gone, another appeared, also holding a cage. This one contained something else, smaller but wilder. A rat. I thought for a moment that the clothes it wore, drenched in a bib of black blood, were prison overalls, but I was wrong. It was wearing beige combats, and when it moved, something glittered around its neck. Dog tags. The rat hacked and slashed at the bars, so hard that its fingers were torn and bloody, its nails long gone. But it didn't care. Of course it didn't. It was mindless, emotionless, just a vehicle of flesh controlled by the nectar inside, nectar that gushed from its distended jaws. Once more the cage was pushed up against the metal fence around the pool, the two hatches sliding open as one. In the blink of an eye the rat was out, swinging onto the inside of the pool cage like a monkey at the zoo. The scientists fell away, but one was too slow. The rat reached through the gap and grabbed his mask, wrenching him forward so hard that his head bounced off the metal. A dozen arms wrapped themselves around the injured scientist, pulling him away before the rat could inflict further damage. I was still retreating, shuffling on my knees towards the far side of the pool, my gown drenched in blood. The berserker was studying me, not showing any sign of movement. I'd fought creatures like it before, back in the prison, and I'd won. But right now, drained of nectar, I didn't stand a chance, especially with a rat in here as well. The smaller creature turned to me now, its eyes like lumps of coal in its head, a cry of animal rage bubbling from its lips. I felt cold tiles against my back, realised there was nowhere to run. Above me, the scientists had returned to their bars, their desire to watch obviously overpowering any thoughts of personal safety. I held up my left hand to them, even this seeming like an impossible act, silently begging them for mercy. But there was no compassion in their eyes, only greed. With another gargled howl, the rat dropped into the pool, its bare feet slapping in the mush as it charged at me. Its broken hands were held out towards my throat, its teeth gnashing at the air. It was possible that it only wanted to bite me, infect me with the nectar. If that was the case, then I could let it. It would give me strength, help me survive. But it could just as easily open up my throat, finish me off. It was a chance I really didn't want to take. Sheer terror got me to my feet, the side of the pool the only thing stopping me from toppling over. The rat was almost on me, launching itself into the air so fast it was just a blur against the tiles. I did the only thing I could think of, sticking out the blade of my hand, hoping that the freak would impale itself. I closed my eyes, waited for the impact, but it never came. There was a choked squeak, the snap of a bone breaking. I looked past the extended blade of my hand to see the rat in a pile on the floor, one leg sticking out at a bizarre angle. Towering over it was the Berserker. The rat screeched, no emotion registering on its twisted face. It didn't pay any attention to the creature next to it, just hurled itself at me again. This time I saw what happened. The Berserker lashing out with one of its arms, catching the rat in the ribs and sending it flying. Its flailing form hit the side of the pool hard enough to crack the tiles before falling into the muck. Despite its injuries, the rat looked as if it was about to try again, but before it could move, the Berserker was on it. It hefted the squirming creature up in its two giant fists, then, with a grunt of effort, bent it in half, snapping its spine. I stared at the Berserker, unable to believe what I'd just seen. It looked back at me, beads of oil-black blood dripping from its ivory skin. Then, incredibly, it walked over to me and laid the dead rat at my feet. It shuffled back, never taking those egg yolk eyes away from mine. I stared into them, wondering what thoughts were going through its head, and whether they were its thoughts at all. Was it a Berserker who stared at me, who nodded expectantly towards the corpse? Or was it Alfred Furness? "What is it doing, Alex?" I heard Panettiere shout. The Berserker turned in the direction of her voice, uttering a bark like a gorilla's, a warning. I didn't answer, I didn't move, my confusion too great. The hulking beast pushed the corpse towards me, the way a mother lion might offer a dead gazelle to her cubs, a high-pitched whine escaping its tiny mouth. I understood what it meant. It wanted me to eat. I struggled to move, eventually managing to crouch over the rat. Somebody was banging on the bars above me. "Hey!" one of the scientists yelled. "This isn't part of the experiment. Leave it alone!" But no sooner had he spoken than I heard Panettiere countermand the order. "Leave them. Let's see what happens." I ignored them all, lowering my mouth towards the rat. I could see the nectar still pumping out of it, the crimson specks inside glowing like molten lava. My strength faltered, but the Berserker scooped the corpse up, pushing it against my lips. "Stop this!" the man's voice said. "Take them down, right now!" "No!" screamed Panettiere, but as she did so, there was a shot, something thudding into the Berserker hard enough to rock it on its heels. It grunted, but still it didn't move, holding the rat in front of me. I glanced once more at Panettiere, her delight visible even behind her mask. Then I opened my mouth and let the nectar flood inside. That familiar, disgusting taste gushed over my tongue, unbearably rancid, but it was soon forgotten as the poison hit my system. It burned through me, strength raging into every muscle like a flash fire. I gulped down as much as I could, even as another shot punched through Berserker's chest, then a third, finally driving the creature back. It didn't matter. I had no need of outside assistance now. I was up and moving before I was even aware of it, tossing away the corpse as I propelled myself up the side of the pool and grabbed hold of the bars with the mutated fingers at the end of my left arm. Everybody staggered away, all except for Panettiere, who didn't even flinch. I thrust the blade of my hand through, trying to stab her, to end her, but she was just out of reach. She studied me for a moment as I tried to smash my way through. Then she turned and gave another order. "That's enough. Sedate him. Dice the other one." Half a dozen soldiers pushed through the scientists, rifles aimed at my chest. I dropped from the bars, but I was too late, a flurry of red-feathered darts whispering between them and into my skin. I fought the drowsiness, running to the far side of the pit and trying my luck there. I didn't even make it up the wall, my feet slipping, depositing me into the filth. The pool was filling, not with liquid but with darkness. Those same nightmare trees pushing up from the tiles, growing to full height in the blink of an eye. My thoughts were crushed into dust beneath the nectar and the tranquilizer darts. There was nothing left inside my mind, a black void of utter stillness. I scanned the pool, my gaze falling on the Berserker. It was tripping backwards, bullet holes erupting across its torso like bulging red eyes. It collapsed to its knees, its mouth opening, a single cry dropping out. I don't know why. but I used the very last of my strength to crawl through the muck of the pool towards the Berserker. It's not as if I wanted to save it. It was too late for that anyway. Not with at least 20 armour-piercing rounds inside it. No, it was something else. I guess when you're trapped inside a cage, hundreds of eyes watching you teeter on the edge of death, you just want to know you're not alone. The Berserker was on its side now, a lake of nectar spilling out from its belly and chest. It blinked its pus-yellow eyes at me, and it might have been my imagination, but I swear it lifted a hand, letting me crawl closer before wrapping it protectively around my shoulders. It was the last thing it would ever do, because with a bone-breaking judder, its body stalled, then lay still. I looked up past its knotted limb, realised that Panettiere was watching me from the edge of the pool. She was smiling. The searing lights of the room reflected in the glass of her visor, looking like a grin that seemed to stretch off the sides of her face, making her eyes gleam. And the last thought I had, before falling out of time, was that she looked just like the warden. The stranger. I'll make this the last one today because, like I said, not much sleep. I like this one. The nightmare was waiting for me as if I had never left, and it was more real than ever. My vision was blurred, the way it is when you wake from a deep sleep, but even though I couldn't see the orchard, I knew I was back there. I could feel the mush of fly-blown fruit between my bare toes, worms squirming beneath me. That cold wind still brushed across my scalp like fingers, only now it carried with it the smell of the place, the stench of rotting wood, of rancid blood and bird crap, and past that something else, something worse. I gagged, doubling over, my body able to move, but my feet once again rooted in place as though the hands of dead men rose from the soil to claim me. Tears streamed down my face as I fought for breath. I was coughing so hard that something clawed up from my windpipe, scuttling from my mouth and over my cheek, disappearing into my hair. I moaned, a noise of utter desperation. It was just too much. The real world and the dream world, opposite corners of the same hell. And I haven't even opened my eyes yet. I couldn't, because I knew that he was there. The stranger. Maybe if I couldn't see him, then he wouldn't be able to see me. It was the sobs that finally made me look. Pitiful cries that could have been my own, but which came from the other side of the clearing. I wiped my eyes, seeing that the kid, Alfred Furness, was still nailed to the tree, his body hanging like a broken branch. At first I thought he was alone, and then I saw the stranger. He stood right in front of the boy, his body nothing more than a silhouette, a pit that sucked in the sickly light of the orchard and returned only cold waves of darkness. It was as if the view before me was a photograph and the shape of the man had been burned out of it. He wasn't human. He was the absence of humanity. He was tall, towering over the kid by a good metre. Tall and skeletally thin, his arms and legs too long, too many joints there, his fingers like distended shadows. His spine was crooked like an old man's, and yet this thing, whatever it was, reeked of power. It looked down at the boy, not moving, just staring. And even though Furness's cries tore at my heart, I was glad of them, because it meant the stranger wasn't looking at me. Something fell from a branch overhead, a soft, feathered body that struck the ground, flapping its wings a couple of times before lying still. Another followed, then a third, this one so close it almost hit me. I watched the crow's wild eyes fade. 7, maybe 8 more birds dropped dead from the trees, and where they landed the grass and weeds turned brown, shrivelling back into the soil. Even the movement of the worms grew more urgent, their bodies writhing as they fought to escape the putrefaction that gripped the orchard. Furness's cries reached a crescendo, a symphony of terror as he tried to wiggle his way free from the tree. The stranger walked around him, studying him, and even though I could make out neither eyes nor a mouth in the pool of darkness that served as his face, I knew he was smiling. There seemed to be no end to the torment, and I wondered whether Furness's misery would go on forever, whether I would be stuck with him in this loop of broken time. But eventually the boy grew weak, his cries drying up, his body trembling like a dead leaf. His head lolled to his chest, and I thought for a moment he had finally died. Then his mouth opened and he spoke in a whisper. "What do you want?" The stranger didn't reply. Instead, he reached down towards the pool of blood that had formed beneath Furness. He didn't bend. It was as if his arm extended, stretched out like licorice. One finger uncurled from his loose fist, the nail as long as my palm, and he used it to scoop up a nugget of crimson soil. The arm swept back up in a lazy arc, contracting to its former length. A crack opened up in his head, and he popped the nugget into it, his entire body shivering with perverse delight. And then the stranger spoke, or rather communicated. The outline of his face that wasn't a face unfolding and refolding like an origami mask. There were no words, but there was meaning. It pulsed out of him in waves, making the trees and the wind whisper, making the ground rumble, and the air above us thunder. The whole orchard becoming a voice that shifted in pitch and volume, the effect making me seasick. "Death is nearly upon you, Alfred, but death doesn't have to be the end." The boy didn't reply. He just hung there, and I knew that he was willing his own passing, that he was praying for the end to come, because better that death took him than this thing. I understood it because the same thoughts were racing through my own mind. The stranger reached out again, a dark shadow that unfolded beneath Furness's chin, lifting up his head. His fingers were so long that it looked as though a huge spider was resting on the boy's face. "Was your crime worth it, boy?" This time Furness responded. "You know I didn't do it. You killed Joseph. You are my brother's murderer." The stranger's hand retreated, reminding me of the way a snail's horns shrink into its head when they're touched. His knot face opened and closed, a myriad of dark corners weaving in and out of each other. And once again, his wordless message was clear. "I killed your brother in order to save you." I knew that was a lie, and Furness did too, because he shot the man a look of undiluted hatred. The stranger's face moved relentlessly, reminding me of the cogs and blades inside an engine, and yet somehow I could still see the smile there. A noise rose from him, a wet purr that thrummed across the clearing, and once again he reached out, fingers pushing the hair back from Furness's face, then resting over his brow. As soon as the contact was made, shadow against flesh, an image flashed up in my mind. Furness, free of the tree, his eyes burning black, radiating strength. Another followed, the same boy crouched over the bodies of his accusers, the people who had crucified him, his mother included, steam rising from their corpses. Him again, older now, at the head of an army, the soldiers behind him half man and half beast. Berserkers. The visions blinked on and off, each brighter than the last. Past them I could see Furness thrashing against the man's touch, and I knew that he was seeing the same things. He was witnessing his future. "Don't listen to him!" I shouted, my fear overcoming my paralysis. "It doesn't have to be like that." Without looking at me, the stranger stretched out his other hand, the shadow sweeping over the clearing, impossibly far, clamping across my face. It was as if my head had been dunked in ice water, the sensation taking my breath away. Before I could recover, more images pummeled their way into my brain, this time showing Furness and me together, beating our enemies into the dirt, riding high over the world. I fought to block out the images, the same way I'd fought a lifetime ago back in the warden's screening room, the same way I'd fought every time the nectar raged inside me. but it was impossible to deny that rush of excitement. When you're powerless, what greater temptation can there be than a promise of omnipotence? "Your time will come true, Alex." Furness was struggling as hard as I was, but I could see that his resolve was weakening. He'd been shown an alternative to death. He'd been shown a world in which he was more than just a kid, more than just a victim of injustice. He'd been shown a future where he could take his revenge. I'd been there. I knew exactly how that felt. The stranger's hand dropped away from me. He stepped towards Furness, cradling the boy's head against his chest, almost tenderly. "Do you accept my gift, Alfred?" Furness's head lolled against the stranger's body. He was almost gone. Another minute maybe, and death would claim him. I was amazed that he'd lasted as long as he had, his body sliced open by his own mother's blade. You killed my brother," Furness whispered. "I'll kill you for that." "The only way to kill me is to accept my offer." Furness lifted his head as best he could, his eyes glinting at the thought of retribution. The stranger continued to stroke his hair with his branch-like fingers, the same cooing purr vibrating from his throat. "Joseph died for you, Alfred. He gave his life so that you might live forever. If you do not accept, he will have been lost for nothing. If you do not accept, I live on to kill again." The boy's eyes were now closed. He could sense death there. We both could. And I guess that's why he made the decision he did. Not because of his brother, not so that he might live forever, but because when you're standing on the edge of the void, when you feel yourself about to tumble into the unfathomable, unthinkable darkness of death, you will do anything to stop it. I willed for him to pass, but it was pointless. I already knew Furness's story after all. I already knew what his answer would be. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "I accept." The stranger's face unfolded, shadowed petals blossoming, contracting, blossoming again. Then he threw back his head and laughed, not a sound, but a sonic pulse that exploded through the orchard, splitting trees, bringing branches crashing to the earth. He stepped away, holding his left arm in front of Alfred Furness, his hand tilted back. Then he dragged the nails of his other hand across his own wrist. Black blood began to fall to the earth, slowly at first, then gushing like an oil well. My heart recognised what it was before my brain did, my pulse beating furiously. Nectar! The stranger pulled the boy's head back with his free hand and brought the severed vein to Furness's mouth. The boy choked as the liquid flowed into him, disappearing down his throat. Nectar gushed from between his lips, but not for long. Soon he was swallowing it eagerly, his body demanding more, like a starving man at a banquet. Furness's face was changing, his cheeks bulging as the tainted blood poured into him, surging down his gullet. He spat out a cry, tugging his right hand until it tore free from the nail, clamping his fingers around the stranger's arm and holding it there. He did the same with his left, the effort cleaving his palm in two and sending him crashing to his knees. But he didn't seem to notice the pain. All he cared about was the creature's blood, the nectar. My mind reeled, unable to believe what I was seeing. I knew this was a dream, taking place only in my head, but if Furness was right, if this was a memory for him, it meant this had actually happened. The stranger was growing weak, the dense cloud of shadow that hung around him becoming less opaque. His right arm began to crumple, folding in on itself like the tendril of a burning plant. One of his legs buckled, then the other, and he staggered to his knees. It was as if he was sinking into a vast sea trench, the pressure of the water compressing his body. With an almighty crack, his head began to shrink, deflating, crushed by an invisible force, pulled down into his neck. Furness kept drinking, consuming every last drop of the stranger's blood until all that remained was a desiccated husk on the orchard ground. The kid was crouching on his haunches, more animal than human. He shook himself, tar-coloured blood spraying from his lips, and when he opened his mouth, a growl fell out of it, one that pulsed around the orchard with the same ground-shaking force as the stranger's laughter. He cocked his head towards me, and when he opened his eyes they were vortexes of shadow, so deep and so furious that they threatened to pull me in. "We are all puppets hanging over an ocean of madness," the boy said, and it was no longer the whine of a child, but the voice I knew so well, that thunderous whisper of Alfred Furness. "All it takes is one simple snip, and we fall." He held his ruined hands to his face, and I could see the flesh there knitting back together, the stranger's blood healing him. When he turned back to me, his mouth had flopped open into a cruel imitation of a smile. "Now you know." He threw himself across the clearing, running on all fours, his black eyes seeming to pump out their own impossible light that corrupted everything it touched. I saw trees crack, the bark splitting, apples disappearing beneath growing tides of mould, dead birds composing into tattered skeletons, all in the blink of the boy's nightmare gaze. With a laugh, he vanished among the trees, but his voice floated back to me on the breeze, as clear as if he was standing right next to me, whispering in my ear, "Now you know how it all began." And there we go. For those of you wondering where the nectar came from, now you know. Brilliant. Thank you very much for joining me. The next chapter is called History. Maybe we'll find out a little bit more about what this thing is. And yeah, I hope I'll get a bit more sleep tonight. And if I do, maybe we'll tackle 3 chapters tomorrow instead of just 2. I hope you're all well. I hope you have a lovely, lovely, lovely day. And yeah, I will see you in the morning. Bye. Oh, I missed the stop button. Bye.